Okay, let's dive in. Thank you for taking the time to arrive at this video. In this training, we are going to be covering the difference between fats and fatty acids in the way that we include them in our diet and in our cooking. And the reason why this is so important is because there are pretty significant health effects that happen as a result of which fats and oils you consume in your day-to-day diet and in your cooking. And therefore, as we're going to cover those differences in this training and the effects they have on your body, you'll be able to make more informed decisions with the latest research, more informed decisions about what you want to buy and purchase and put into your body for the health effects that you want to experience. So let's dive in. I'm going to look to keep this as simple as possible and use as little jargon and big words as possible. If there are any, I'll explain them. So we're going to talk about the three different types of fatty acids. Okay, we have saturated fats. I'm sure you've heard of those. We have unsaturated fats, and actually unsaturated fats then break off into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. And there's a big difference between these two that we're going to get into as the video continues. Saturated, mono, and poly. Any type of fatty acid, all fats are is just a little chain of lipids. Lipids is another word for fats, right? It's just a little chain of these little mini fats that we can see under a microscope. It's a chain of these put together in a certain way. And in the way that they're put together in their uniform way determines if they are saturated, monounsaturated, or poly. So what happens is, if we look at saturated fats, they usually come from animal sources, although there is like coconut oils, which is a plant source. So with saturated fats in its little uniform structure, it's saturated, it's packed. What that means is it has no available space. It's saturated from space. It's packed. It has no available space for an oxygen atom to come in and join that chain to oxidize it, which means that saturated fats are very stable. That's why, like coconut oils, that's why other saturated fats like ghee can be left out of the fridge for up to 6 months. They're very stable. And because they're very stable, that means they have a higher smoke point and they're less likely to break down when you cook them. So when you're cooking with saturated fats, which are actually really needed and healthy for you because the brain is made up of 60% saturated fat. The insulation around your brain nerves is made up of saturated fat. There's a ton of cholesterol that your brain needs to its composition. So therefore, saturated fats are needed. And because they're stable, that means they won't break down or oxidize or become rancid into something else, which is what we're going to be talking about next with some of these unsaturated fats. Some of my favorite saturated fats to cook with, ghee is number one, especially if it's A2 ghee. You can look that up. Or if it's goat ghee, which is also A2 ghee, it just means it's less allergenic for people that have some lactose issues, but the lactose has been taken out of ghee anyway, so it's really clean. There's tallow, which is the American word for beef dripping. So tallow and beef dripping is also a healthy saturated fat. There is coconut oil as well. The reason I don't really recommend coconut oil is because it's pretty much completely saturated fat. And although saturated fats are great for you, like I said, some of the other fats like ghee or tallow are a mixture of saturated fat and monounsaturated fat, which is also very healthy for you to have the balance, and also has omega-3s, like ghee has omega-3 as well. And so because of that, because they have more of a balance between saturated fat and monounsaturated and some omega-3, whereas coconut oil is only saturated fat and very heavy on that, it's less balanced. And so I would prefer a more balanced option. So we've briefly covered saturated fats. Now, if we look into unsaturated fats, okay, let's look at mono and polyunsaturated. The difference between both of those is the word that comes before it, mono or poly. And if we come back to that uniform structure we were talking about earlier, about how fats are made up on a microscopic level of these little uniform of lipids together, mono, you may know, means one, and poly means multiple. So what that means is monounsaturated fats have one space for an oxygen atom to join the chain, if it does at all, because they're typically very stable. So it doesn't always happen. It's less prone to oxidation. Polyunsaturated means there is multiple spaces for these little carbons in the uniform to break off and join with an oxygen and bring an oxygen in. And when that happens, That's the oxidation. That's the breakdown. That's the rancidity. So although we're told polyunsaturated fats are the healthier fats for us, what we're not told is that once they oxidize, once they break down, once they become rancid, which is very likely, if not certain, they become unhealthy for you. They drive inflammation. They cause negative health consequences in the body. But of course, on paper, if you've freshly made some polyunsaturated fats and you consume them within 10 minutes of the source of grinding up your own flax seeds, maybe that's okay. But the research shows even on the way in, that's going to oxidize. So I stay away from those. Polyunsaturated fats will break down. Monounsaturated fats is also neutral and closer to the saturated side of things. It's less likely to break down. Any cholesterol in the monounsaturated fat is less likely to oxidize. It's much more stable, much more shelf stable, because it only has one space for an oxygen to join that uniform chain of the fat. So how do you use this in your day-to-day? Just keep it very simple. I like to cook with animal fats. As I said, ghee is number one. Ghee is number one. You then have, of course, tallow and dripping. I would stay away from coconut oil. If needed, you can now use as well the monounsaturated fats. My favorite one for that is cold pressed macadamia oil. It's 80% monounsaturated, something like 18% saturated, which leaves just 2% of polyunsaturated. And the 1-on-1 of that two is omega-6 and omega-3. It's got a pretty good even ratio of those. And so I love macadamia oil for that reason. I prefer to use it and drizzle it cold, but if needed, you can do some medium temperature cooking with it because it is less likely to break down and oxidize. It just is. To finish, some last facts that I think are really important when it comes to polyunsaturated fats and the effects in the body to really drive this home now is that when we consume these oxidized fats, such as oxidized omega-6, otherwise known as linoleic acid, when we consume these oxidized, broken down polyunsaturated fats, they get into your adipose tissue, which is a word for your fat tissue. They get into your fat cells, they get into your liver, into your arteries, but especially into the liver, into cardiovascular system and your fat tissue. And they can stay there for years. 2 years is generally the minimum, but they can stay there even more. So what happens is these polyunsaturated fats that most people consume way too much of, like 15, 20, 30 times too much of. What happens is you have this oxidized cholesterol, which is terrible for cardiovascular disease because it's damaged cholesterol that becomes sticky and clumps up as a result of makes your body think that there's injury going on in the arteries. So you have this damaged cholesterol coming in. You have the damaged oxidized omega-6. Omega-6 in itself is inflammatory anyway. So then you have the inflammatory omega-6 coming in and it's oxidized. Your body is going to drive more inflammation to clear that, which is why a higher intake of polyunsaturated fats, especially when they've been oxidized, is linked to metabolic issues and diseases such as cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, whereas omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. It reduces inflammation in the immune system, reduces systemic inflammation in the body. Macadamia oil has a perfect balance of omega-3 to omega-6. Ghee has a great balance of omega-3 to omega-6, and it's also very saturated. So keep it simple, folks. Cook with animal fats where you can. Cook with the saturated fats. Drizzle the monounsaturated fats, such as the macadamia, and you will do great and watch your health and inflammation transform. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, you can like or comment on the video, comment your thoughts, comment future questions that you may have, and I will endeavor to make more of these videos. And to see more of those videos that come out, you can also subscribe to the channel as well.